In today's video, I continue my journey through the main questline featured in the Elder Scrolls 3, Morrowind. Last time, Caius sent me to the city of Vivec in search of 3 different informants. Each one told me pieces of information regarding the 6th house, the Nerevarine cult, and the dissident priests. Next, Caius sent me to the village of Aldrune in search of a former Ashlander, Hasor Saint Zubani. Hasor informed me of the Urshilaku tribe, the most prominent Ashlander tribe to be a part of the Nerevarine cult. Before getting sent off to them and speaking with their leader, Caius lets me in on what's really going on. The Emperor believes that I could fit the Nerevarine prophecies, and that's why I'm being sent on all of these quests to find out as much information as possible. Traveling far to the northwest of Vardenfell, I located the Urshilaku tribe and gained their trust. The chief, Solmatul, granted me an audience with the Oracle Seer, Nabani Mesa. Mesa tells me all sorts of information on the Nerevarine prophecies, 7 curses, the stranger, and the moon and star. She asks me to acquire more information about the lost prophecies and hints that the dissident priests of the temple might know more about them. With that, the adventure continues. Leaving the Urshilaku camp, I used a scroll of divine intervention which brought me to a place called Fort Darius by the village of Nissus. I'm not sure if this was the best course of action, but I really didn't want to walk all the way back. I didn't end up spending that much time in Nissus, as I hopped on a silt strider to Aldrune and from Aldrune to Balmora. I went straight back to Caius's home and relayed the new information to him.
You seem like very good company.
He's astonished at the idea that I could really be the Nerevarine. He says he'll have to get a word to Mehra Milo in order to get more information on the lost prophecies. But first, there's a pressing matter to attend to. He says it's a really tough quest and asks if I'm truly ready for it. I tell him yes, and he hands me 400 gold for new gear, spells, potions, etc. He reminds me too that it's better to flee from a losing battle instead of needlessly dying. He then goes on to explain the quest. Apparently, Fort Buckmoth sent a patrol to Narmok. They were in search of smugglers with 6th house connections. They instead stumbled across a 6th house base, shrine, and a priest named Dagoth Gers. Caius says that I'm to report to Reza Pulia at Fort Buckmoth, as she could tell me more of what the patrol had found there. My ultimate goal is to find the base, kill Dagoth Gers, and bring back a report to Caius on the 6th house. I ask further about this base, and Caius informs me that it's actually inside of a cave local to Narmok called Elunaby. There was only one soldier left alive from the patrol, and he had apparently died from something called corprus disease. The trooper reported everything he saw, including the shrine, the priest, monsters, and cultists. I quickly asked about Fort Buckmoth, and Caius tells me its location is just south of Aldrune. Leaving Caius's home, I had some loot that I wanted to sell, as well as some spells that I wanted to purchase. So I paid a visit to the local shops of Balmora and dumped all of my extra gear. Something I find quite entertaining about the shopkeepers, or at the very least, Meldor in Balmora, is that he equipped some of the gear I had just sold him. So now he's wearing half of the Dark Brotherhood assassin armor. I'm not sure why only half though. Once finished, I went to the Mages Guild Hall to buy some new spells. I was looking for Levitate and a Light spell, the latter mostly because the game can get really dark in dungeons and during the night. I managed to find Levitate as well as some new destruction spells to try out. I then learned that there's a mage at the Aldrune Hall that sells a light spell, so I used the Mages Guild transportation services for the first time, and it was pretty neat to arrive at a different setting. Here, I found the mage I needed to speak with, bought the light spell, and then created a new version to fit my needs. After all of this, I left the guild hall and exited through the south gate of Aldrune. Almost right away, I spotted Fort Buckmoth. Making my way over and then inside of the structure, Reza Pulia was pacing around the front room. Approaching her, she introduces herself and takes a guess that Caius was the one to send me over. She follows up by asking if I'm here to handle the 6th house base. Inquiring about it, she reiterates that only one trooper returned. He died shortly after coming back as the corprus disease took hold and left him horrifically disfigured and out of his mind. While in a frenzy, he spoke of the Elunaby cavern. It's not on any of the local maps, although the citizens of Narmok are likely to know where it is. The troopers sent there fought with cultists and disfigured man-beasts, likely as a result of corprus. While fleeing the caves, they ran into Dagoth Gers, the priest that is apparently half man, half creature. Gers slew the entire patrol minus the one, leaving him as a messenger. The priest told him that the sleeper awakes, the sixth house has risen, Dagoth-ur is Lord and he is his priest, and all will be one with him in the flesh. The trooper, awakening outside of the cavern, returned back to Fort Buckmoth, although practically unrecognizable. He rambled on and wouldn't respond to questions until his foreseen death. I asked further about Alunaby, but she couldn't tell me any more new information about it. Out of curiosity and fear, I then asked what corprus disease was. She responded by saying the trooper's flesh became swollen and covered in growths. His bones twisted and lost their shape. He spoke to himself as if in a dream. The Legion couldn't recognize him at first, and only by his equipment were they able to place his identity. The fort chaplain tried everything he could to heal him, but nothing worked. He died soon after. The sight was enough to scare all of the soldiers at the base. Polia herself is even shaken up by it. I then asked about Narmak, and she gave me directions on how to best get there. It's a small fishing village west of here on the Bitter Coast. She then marks it on my map to make it easier for me to find. Leaving Fort Buckmoth, I decided to ignore her directions and just travel as the crow flies to Narmak in order to get there quicker. I feel as though this quest really set up the anticipation and danger perfectly, as to be quite frank, I was a little nervous to go inside of those caverns. The enemies sound powerful and evil, while the corprus disease sounds much worse. Along the way, I only encountered a handful of enemies, most notably cliff racers, guars, and nix hounds. There came a point where I ended up on a road and stumbled across a friendly NPC. I assumed Sozia Christiana had some side quest to tell me about, but she didn't. In fact, she offered me nothing, which I found really interesting. I wondered what she was doing all the way out here. Nearing my destination, I wandered into what appeared to be a guar farm. I was ready for a fight with what looked like to be half a dozen of them, but was pleasantly surprised when none of them were bothered by my presence. I approached the only NPC around, Siorvar Horsemouth, and noticed that he was in fact one of the Blades trainers recommended by Caius. I thought it was pretty neat that he was all the way out here. Moving along the final stretch, I made my way through some swamplands and ended up laying eyes on the small fishing village. It was a quaint little settlement, but it looked nice enough for what it was. In Narmak, I went to the first citizen I could find, albeit there were 3 of them together,
My time is short, so get on with it.
and began asking about Alunaby. I got the same response from every single one of them, that they didn't trust me enough to talk about that. Finally, I bribed the wood elf, Angelos, with 100 gold, and he began to talk. Alunaby is apparently an old sea cave up on the north end of this small island. It's right by a place called Cartag Point. Although Angelos says that I shouldn't go looking around in there, as someone might not like it. I followed up on Cartag Point and he said that it's a landmark represented by a gigantic boulder. I left the conversation and began walking to the northernmost part of the island. It turns out that I'm still bad at following directions, as I made it to Cartag Point, but got distracted by the big boulder itself on the other side of the water. Thinking the entrance was by the big rock, I looked for quite some time, only to remember Angelos saying that it was on the same island as Narmak. From there, I located the cavern doors to Alunaby pretty quickly, and then entered on inside. My personal experience in Alunaby was honestly pretty stressful and a little bit miserable. The first enemy I encountered was called a Dreamer, and they were really easy to defeat. More or less, a Dreamer is a Dunmer without clothing, and they use a club for their attacks. 2 casts of shock magic and he was dead. It was the next enemy though that caused me way too many problems. They're called Ashland Slaves. They don't have an incredible amount of health, but they do hit really hard and are really good at parrying spells. My Magicka bar isn't the greatest, but it gets the job done for keeping my spells coming whilst killing enemies quickly. These Ashland Slaves have practically unlimited use of shock spells and they rapid fire them. So if I was on the same inclination/level as them, they were excellent at cancelling out my spells with theirs. This would quickly result in me running out of Magicka and having to switch to my spear. To be honest, this is where I sort of had a moment of reflection and the most stress, as my spear attacks weren't doing any damage whatsoever. I know it has practically everything to do with fatigue, but I was still just really disappointed in my ability with them, as my character was pretty much rendered useless without magic. I had no way of fighting back when my bars were depleted, and it was honestly really discouraging. I'd have to constantly leave the battle with the Ashland Slaves, go into another zone without enemies, rest, and then restart the whole process. It was this experience that makes me want to do a training arc with my spear in hopes of being able to actually rely on it in battle. It's only level 36 as a major skill, and that's just unacceptable at this point. For now though, I had to do the strategy of fleeing battle, healing, and then returning. Other enemies faced in here were scamps, ghosts, and corprus stalkers, although I'll get into that last one later. I started out in a zone called Carcass of the Saint. From here, there was an immediate decision to be made on which way to turn. I went right and ended up in a zone called Marowak's Spine. As a side note, I noticed there's been a few areas in the game which share the same name as Generation 1 Pokemon: Marowak, Weepinbell, and Kakuna. I'd like to believe that it's more than just a coincidence at this point, but I won't make any calls on that. The Elunaby Caverns, at least to me, were quite complex. Each zone weaves in and out of one another from multiple entrances and exits, but I think what really made it difficult to navigate through this was the fact that I struggled with defeating the Ashland slaves. Having to run in and out of zones in a panic, constantly backtracking is a surefire way to get lost. At one point, I searched the corpse of an Ashland slave and contracted Ashwoe Blight. It dropped my intelligence and willpower attributes by quite a bit, but fortunately I still had some potions to cure it from the last quest. Eventually, I was faced with the options of going into new zones, either one called Tainted Marrow or another called Blackened Heart. I chose the former and ended up wandering around, battling more enemies and getting more lost. As mentioned prior, the different zones interweave and connect on multiple levels, so what I thought was a new area would actually lead me back to the Saint's Carcass or Marowak's Spine. Something else that also caused me to shoot myself in the foot was that every time I'd rest, I would get nearer to the respawn timer for enemies that I had just defeated. There were times where Ashland slaves were waiting for me in areas that I had already cleared out, and it was really disheartening to see. Eventually, I managed to make my way back to the entrance of the Blackened Heart zone. Along the way though, I encountered my first corprus stalker. The thing was actually pretty freaky and definitely topped Oblivion Zombies for what it was trying to do. They have a faint look of humanity in them, but their skin, facial expression, and sounds are certainly no longer human. The Blackened Heart zone gave me the second most trouble in terms of getting through. Waiting for me on the inside was an Ashland slave, and I was out of magicka. However, if I were to backtrack into Marowak's Spine to rest, it would have resulted in me facing a whole lot more enemies. It took me a few attempts, but I had to use my Scroll of Hellfire on it. Doing so, I managed to kill it with one hit. I'd later come to regret this decision though. Eventually, my character got to level 5, which came with a nice little buff, especially for right now. Blackened Heart would soon lead me to the Soul's Rattle zone, which would be my last stop in the Elunaby Caverns. I wandered a little bit in and came across a unique room which contained pillars, scripture, a freaky effigy, and a living figure I had never seen before. The thing had begun to run towards me, and startled, I moved back up into the previous area. Doing this, I aggroed onto two dreamers. I quickly took care of them, and before I could move any more back, the figure began to speak with me. It was Dagoth Gers, and he said that the 6th house greets me, calling me Lord Nerevar. He introduces himself as priest of the Elunaby Shrine and minister to the 6th house servants. Dagoth had apparently told him about my arrival. Gers wishes to extend his lord's friendship to me. I ask about the 6th house, and he responds by saying that it wasn't dead, but simply sleeping. Dagoth has apparently returned to free Morrowind from foreign rulers and so-called divine pretenders. I asked about the Elunaby Shrine, and he says it's a small retreat for servants of the 6th house to learn more about Dagoth ways and to grow stronger. He says that they do sacrifices here, and that there are smaller shrines throughout the province. The biggest one, however, is underneath Red Mountain, where Dagoth resides with his closest servants. I then asked about the 6th house servants, and Garrus responded by saying that I will continue to be tacked on site until I pledge my loyalty to the house and Lord Dagoth. He also notes that although I've seen plenty of atrocities and abominations defending the 6th house here, the highest and mightiest of them are called Ash Poets, Ascended Sleepers, and Ash Vampires. I then asked Garrus about the Lord's friendship. He responded by saying that Dagoth himself has given him a message to convey to me. Once we were friends and brothers, Lord Nerevar, in peace and in war. Yet, beneath Red Mountain, you struck me down as I guarded the treasure you bound me by oath to defend. But, remembering our friendship, I would forgive you and raise you high in my service. My Lord Dagoth bids you come to Red Mountain. For the friendship and honor that once you shared, he would grant you counsel and power, if only you would pledge that friendship anew. I am not your Lord Dagoth, yet I too would say to you, do you come with weapons to strike me down, or would you put away your weapon and join me in friendship? Finally, when I asked about why I am their enemy, Garrus responded by saying that I need to go to Lord Dagoth's citadel in Red Mountain and make my submission. Until then, I'll be treated as their antagonist. This is where the conversation ends and the battle begins. The boss fight was intensified by the fact that there was an Ashland slave backing up Dagoth Garrus. So I had my work cut out for me on all levels. Garrus would attack me in close combat, while the Ashland slave would attack from a distance. After dying quite a few times, I made the play of running into the shrine area in which I originally found Garrus. Here it was just me and him for a bit, so I was able to get his health down by quite a lot, firing off frost spells. Eventually, the Ashland slave rejoined the fight, and I was out of magicka. I fled the room and equipped my last combat scroll of Elemental Burst Fire. It was enough to kill the Ashland slave, and Garrus had barely any health left. With no options, I popped 2 potions of Fortify Magicka and cast 1 final frost spell. It hit, and I had successfully defeated Dagoth Garrus. Upon his death, I received the message, with his dying breath, Dagoth Garrus smiles and curses you. Even as my master wills, you shall come to him in his flesh and of his flesh. On his body, he had the message from Dagoth and a 6th house amulet, which seemed very valuable but pretty useless. Before leaving, I looked around the shrine and found a whole bunch of loot placed within open sarcophagi. A lot of it was valuable and some of it my character could even use. Most notable for my needs was a pair of glass boots, which far surpassed the armor rating of my current gear. There were bells in which I could ring, but I wasn't sure what they did as there were no obvious effects. At this point, I just wanted to leave this place. I thought I could just walk out, but everything had respawned back inside of the caverns. I died a couple of times and as a result, decided to use my last divine intervention scroll to get out of here. I was transported back to Fort Buckmoth and found myself relieved. I decided to see if Reza Polia had anything to say on my accomplishment, but she really didn't offer anything new. Everything from here was going fine until I made a grave discovery. Outside of the fort whilst fighting a cliff racer, I popped into my inventory only to notice that I had contracted corprus disease. I tried to heal it with potions, but it wouldn't go away. I went back inside of the fort and spoke with Kokishtan Quaspus, and he told me there was nothing he could do for me. I was a doomed man, and all that was left for me was death. He said that I should go to the corpusarium beneath a place called Telfur. That's my best chance of not infecting others. At this point, I genuinely didn't know if this was a scripted event or not, so I was a bit concerned that my character was going to run into a lot of issues. I quickly traveled back to Balmora from Aldrune and made my way into Caius's home.
Please, I don't wish to catch whatever you have.
He greeted me in quite an unfriendly way, and then we began speaking. We discussed my completion of his orders, and he promoted me to the rank of Traveler. He immediately follows this though by saying he's worried about my current condition of corprus disease, but he may have some good news. Apparently, one of his contacts, Fast Eddie, says that Devaith Fur, an ancient Telvanni wizard who happens to run the very same corpusarium that Quaspus told me to go to, might have a way to cure me. He gives me a Dwemer artifact and 1,000 gold for any disposition increases that need to happen. He also hands me some levitate potions, as apparently Telvanni wizard towers don't have stairs. Once I'm cured, Caius says he has a lead for me on the lost prophecies for Nabani Mesa. I asked Caius about how to get to Telfur, and he gave me specific directions on the best way to get there. Finally, I inquired about Helst Telvanni, and he informed me they're one of the 3 Dunmer great houses of Vardenfell. The house is supposed to dislike politics and foreigners, although the ones on Vardenfell are the black sheep of the family. Exiting the conversation thus ends the quest, 6th house base. Leaving Caius's home, I paid a quick visit to the local merchants in order to dump some of my loot. None of them made outward remarks about my condition, which was good. Afterwards, I followed Caius's directions and went to the Mages Guild Hall. Here, I spoke with Mazzolini Marian for transportation to Sadrith Mora. She unfortunately found my condition appalling and told me to get away. I was able to use her services though and ended up on the east coast of Vardenfell. It seemed like I was in some sort of fort. I assumed Wolverine Hall was some Imperial outpost and Sadrith Mora was a village located to the north. From here, I managed to find my way over to the Fighters Guild Hall, although I did get a little bit lost. I really have to remember to check my local map more. Here, I spoke with someone named Sadrin Irathi, Caius' contact. I asked her about Telfur, and she told me it's a Telvanni tower on an island to the southwest of here. Some landmarks are a ship and a dock, as the entrance is at sea level. Inquiring about the tower, she told me it's not actually a building, but an organic growth made out of stems, caps, mushrooms, and roots. Leaving the Wolverine Hall and addressing the map, it really was a short distance, all things considered. My character is extremely slow while swimming, and to get to Telfur, there's a lot of island hopping to do. So I finally decided to try out my levitate spell. It felt pretty neat to get to move anywhere I wanted to, but it was an extremely slow process. Periodically, when I would rest, I'd receive messages saying my corpus has worsened. I'd be constantly checking my active effects, but didn't notice too much of a difference, unless there was something I was missing. I never checked my appearance though, as I was covered in armor from head to toe most of the time. Eventually, I made it to the landmarks pointed out by Caius and Sandrin and found the entrance inside of Telfur. The tower had a really neat design, showcasing its organic side mixed with the engineering of the enlightened races. It reminded me a lot of the designs seen in Oblivion's Shivering Isles DLC for the dungeons that take place within the trees. I immediately ran into a friendly NPC named Baitfur. She introduced herself as one of the wives of Devaithfur and asked if I'm here to plunder the dungeons, if I have corpus disease, or if I wanted to see the wizard himself. Asking about the disease, she reiterates the point about the corpusarium. I asked about her being a wife to Devaithfur, and she responded by saying that they aren't married, but she was technically created by him. Her and her, I guess, sisters aren't his daughters biologically, but it's almost like they are symbolically. Yet they are all his romantic partners. I was curious what she meant about plundering the dungeon. She said that a lot of people have come into Telfur to try and steal or loot Devaithfur's relics, as he has quite a vast collection. All of them are down in the corpusarium, so whoever's brave enough to face the disease and all of its afflicted can attempt to do so. I then asked about Devaithfur, and she said he's upstairs in his study. This is where the levitate spell and potions are going to be needed. Exiting the conversation, I backtracked to the entrance and ascended up a hallway leading to the Hall of Fur zone. There were no NPCs in this immediate area, but there was some pretty promising loot. I looked around to make sure I was alone and tested to see if there would be any consequences for my theft. There weren't, and I managed to grab some books, miscellaneous items, potions, and alchemy tools among other things. It took me a while to realize that right above my head was the pathway leading further up. I assumed I would have to do some sort of platforming, but instead, all I did was cast Levitate and fly up approximately 20 feet or so until I got to the second level. This area was a small section, and almost immediately, I laid eyes on an older Mer clad in Daedric armor.
What, Outlander? Why do you disturb me?
Approaching him, it was Devaithfur, and he opened up by commenting on the Dwemer artifact given to me by Caius. I was faced with the options of giving him the piece, or showing it to him and then putting it away. I chose the former, and he was pleased on my gift-giving skills and knowledge on his interests. He did end up seeing right through my generosity though, and asked why I was here, citing the dungeon, the divine disease, as well as his daughters. I was curious, so I asked about his kin, and he said that they were apparently the product of experiments. They aren't actually his daughters, but are made of his own flesh. There are apparently 4 of them, and laughs while telling me they're a comfort in his old age. I then ask about the divine disease, and he has a very interesting outlook on it. He thinks it's a blessing and a curse from the gods. He claims that there's actually some good side effects to come from it. I ask further about corprus, and he goes on to say that the disease makes the afflicted immune to all other diseases. He then mentions the Nerevarine prophecies and how the Nerevarine is supposed to be immune to disease. He then makes fun of the idea, calling the savior a fat, disgusting corprus monster that's gone mad. I then decided to tell him that I may be the one to fulfill the Nerevarine prophecies. His demeanor slightly changes. He says that I tell a fascinating story and that I could be the Nerevarine, but it means nothing. He chalks it up to the corpus disease and how all of the victims eventually become delusional. Fur does state though that he has an idea. He has a potion that he's been working on. Its purpose is to cure the disease. The only issue though is that it doesn't work. In fact, it has a fatality rate of 100%. He goes on to say though that in my case, it shouldn't matter. I've got nothing to lose. Before he gives it to me though, he wants me to go into the corpusarium. He wants me to see what the future has in store for me if I don't take it. Also, while I'm there, he wishes me to speak with someone named Yagram Bagarn. Yagram is the oldest victim of corprus that Fur has held down in the dungeons. I'm to retrieve a pair of boots for Fur from Yagram, then I can take the potion. Exiting the conversation, I levitate back down to the first floor of the Hall of Fur. From here, I went back out to the Onyx Hall and took the passageway leading further down to the lower level. Here, there's a bronze doorway in the back which leads to the corpusarium. This cavern is musty, stuffy, and has a strange green glow to it. The first NPC I encountered was an Argonian named Vista Kai. Vista introduced himself as the warden of the corpusarium. He warns me though that although the afflicted down here may attack, I am to endure the hits. If I do them harm, Vista Kai says he will personally see to my actions. I line up outside the gate and prepare myself for what lies ahead. On the other side, I see a door which certainly seems like it could be the right path to take. I open the gate and begin moving. I make it to the crossroads just before the door and see a corpus stalker. It aggroes onto me and I shoot straight for the door leading to a zone called the Bowels. Within the Bowels, I see a horribly mutated monster, one like I've never seen before. It's called a lame corpus, and I think to myself, this must be the worst point of the disease that one can reach. The body is completely swollen, blistered, covered in growths, and rotting. Fortunately for me, it doesn't attack and isn't aggressive. Just beyond the abomination, I see a room with the likes of an NPC I've never seen before. I make my way over and spot more variants of corpus victims. Standing in the back is a very large person held up by mechanical spider legs. Standing with him is one of Fur's daughters. I get in close and this strange large person is the one I'm looking for. Yagram Bagarn. I begin speaking with him. He knows that I'm here for the Dwemer boots. He tells me to tell Devaith that he did what he could and that it takes a specific Dwemer to completely fix them up. He talks down on the boots creator and says it shames his race that this is the work they're going to be remembered by. Very curious, I ask him what he means about his race. He says he was once a master crafter in the service of someone named Lord Kagranak, the chief architect of the Great Second Empire freeholds. Yagram was an engineer and builder of sorts. Unfortunately for Bagarn, the disease has rendered his body useless as well as wiped his memories of those times. He mentions his existence is now bleak, and I inquire further about that. To my surprise, he says that he's the last living dwarf on the province and, as far as he can tell, the whole world. Before contracting the disease, he searched and searched for another of his kind, but to no avail. He asks Fur regularly if there's any sign of the Dwemer, but there never is. Finding this to be extraordinary, I ask about the disappearance of the dwarves. Yagram says he isn't quite sure what happened, as he wasn't there at the time of the disappearance. He was in an outer realm, as he calls it. He searched Red Mountain first, and then began to wander all of Tamriel, looking out for dwarven colonies and any possible survivors. Eventually, returning back to Vardenfell for answers, this is where he contracted corpus disease, and he's been in the corpusarium ever since. He says that he has theories on the disappearance, and I humor him on them. Lord Kagranak designed and crafted tools intended to make the Dwemer race immortal. Many of his Dwemer advisors said that there would be side effects and errors that were unpredictable to foresee. Bagarn says that the Dwemer may have been successful and were granted eternal life. The only caveat is that it could have been in an outer realm or another plane of existence entirely. Or, on the other hand, Lord Kagranak may have completely wiped out the Dwarven race and only one was left alive. I quickly asked about Devaith Fur. Apparently, he was able to somewhat heal Yagram, as when Fur found him, he was pretty far along with the disease. He was able to return him to sound mind, but couldn't do anything for his body. He still holds out hope that Fur will find a cure for him one day. Resuming the task at hand, I asked about the Dwemer boots for Devaith. He handed them over to me saying these belonged to an unfortunate thief. He couldn't do too much in the way of fixing the enchantment and overall function, but cites that he did his best. Taking the boots, I was about to leave when I spotted an iconic book on the ground next to Bagarn. There was Tamrielic lore, potentially the original and first copy ever made. If you've watched some of my previous Oblivion videos, I would cite this book all the time when it came to Daedric artifacts. It was neat to get to see it next to its author. Exiting the bowels and taking my leave from the corprusarium, I went back to the Hall of Fur and delivered the boots to Devaith. He says that the only condition he has for me drinking the potion is that I must do it here in front of him, as it takes course immediately. I have 3 options: agreeing, rejecting it for now, or asking to take it to go. I chose to drink it in front of him and he told me to get ready. He pours it out for me and quickly becomes astonished. The potion works, and before I know it, my corpus disease seems to be completely gone. He checks me over and notes that my symptoms and signs are no longer there. He cleverly explains that I still have the disease, but the cure took all of the negative parts away. That means that I should be immune to blight, corprus, and common diseases. Also, it grants me the power of not aging. First says he'll try it on the other victims down below, but isn't so sure it'll work. The interaction soon runs its course, and it's time to return back to Caius and Valmora. I left the Telvanni Tower and returned back to the Wolverine Hall in order to retrace my steps. From here, I took the Mages Guild teleporter back to Balmora. Then I wandered back over to Caius' home.
I'd be happy to talk. My pleasure, really.
Caius says he's happy to see me and is delighted that I'm cured, but he does have some bad news. It turns out he's been recalled back to the Imperial City. Because of this, I'm being promoted to operative and will now head the Blades here in Vardenfell. He only stayed this long because he wanted to give me my final set of orders. I asked why he's being recalled, and he said it's likely due to his skooma addiction, along with other internal policies. He has to go back as he's afraid of the repercussions for his family back home. Caius says it could also have to do with the Emperor himself, as his health is failing. The succession for a new figurehead is going to be a bad one, with factions and interested parties all vying to gain advantages. To be honest, this was news even to me. I knew that in Oblivion, the Blades all treated him like an old man, but I don't recall anyone ever saying that he was sick or in bad health. Perhaps it was implied, but returning back to the matter at hand, I asked what my duties were as the head of the Blades here, and he said for the most part, it's just a title. Each member has their own duties, and the reason I'm being promoted is so I can resume mine without any interruption. Caius goes on to say that the days of the Empire are numbered, and that upon Uriel's death, it's going to be chaotic. He just wants me to worry about the matters here in Vardenfell for now, as he deems those in the Imperial City as not that important. Inquiring about the promotion, he says that he's unsure how long he'll be gone for, and hands over 750 gold for any expenses. He also gives me his black pants, black shirt, and ring. Finally, I ask what my duties are. He says to continue pursuing the Nerevarine prophecies. Mehra Milo and Vivek should be able to help me find the lost ones, although she's being watched right now. He tells me to keep an eye out for the code word, Amaya, and that she could be in her private quarters away from prying eyes. He wishes me good luck, and the conversation ends. I look at Caius thinking that this could very well be the last time I see him. Thus ends the quest, Corpus Cure. Leaving Caius' home, I quickly visited the merchants to dump my extra gear, and then went on my way. I went to the caravaner, Selvil Seraloth, who's still out of place, and took a silt strider to the city of Vivek. I really didn't feel like walking throughout the whole city in order to reach the temple district. So instead, I had some fun by lining myself up and using a scroll of Icarian flight. I made it to the temple district in a matter of a couple of seconds. I landed in the water surrounding the area and used a levitate potion in order to make landfall. From here, I entered inside the Hall of Wisdom and wandered over to the library of Vivek. Mehra Milo was nowhere to be found here. I checked all over, but there was no sign of her. I even asked one of the local Dunmer, and they echoed Caius' words by saying that she's likely in her quarters. Exiting the library, her room was right down the hall. The door was locked, so I used a scroll of Ondusi's unhinging. Gaining entrance inside, she wasn't in here either, and this is where I took it as a bad sign. I looked around her room and found a letter written to Amaya. The note was cleverly crafted. She made it seem like she was writing to an old friend who was visiting, and detailed her current whereabouts. She asked that Amaya bring her 2 scrolls of divine intervention and listed where they could be bought. She also notes how to get into the Ministry of Truth, stating that I'll need to speak with someone on the outside, and most importantly, I'll be needing the levitate potions she left behind. Addressing the journal, it writes that Mehra Milo is likely imprisoned at the Ministry of Truth and that the Divine Intervention Scrolls are for her and I to escape. Following her instructions clearly, I left the Hall of Wisdom and the Temple District as a whole. I was to go to the Foreign Quarters section and seek out the Mages Guild. I decided to use the Icarian Flight Scrolls again in order to get there quicker. It made me really want to make a spell like this of my own in order to travel to places faster. It admittedly took me a while to find the guild hall though. I didn't know at the very top of the structure there was a central plaza. Eventually though, I discovered it, and from there I sought out Janan Malini of the Mages Guild. I bought the 2 scrolls off of her, and before leaving, I wanted to see what spells everybody was selling. I managed to purchase a decent jump spell, an unlock spell, and a slow fall spell from a high elf named Sirlanwe. I was excited to see how well the jump spell worked, so I wasted a lot of time by finding a spot to rest until I was healed in order to replenish my magicka. Again, forgetting about the corner clubs. Tinur's Hoptoad certainly wasn't bad for movement, but it did use a lot of magicka and didn't last very long. I spoke with the NPC, Dals Aldrin, to learn where the Ministry of Truth was. She told me it was a celestial body, suspended by Vivek's mighty power over the Great Temple. It was really interesting to hear that the floating rock above the temple actually served a purpose. I went back to the Temple District and used one of the levitate potions left for me by Mehra Milo. I went all the way to the top of the walkway and found Milo's contact, Alvela Saram. Mila told me to speak with her, and she said that I wasn't allowed into the ministry, but did ask if I wanted to visit someone. I inquired about that, and Saram said that she heard I was coming. She said her story would be that I overpowered her and took the keys. The keys opened all of the doors leading inside of the ministry, but as for the ones on the inside, I'll have to find a way to unlock those on my own. As for Mehra, she'll be in a cell on the far right of the prison keep. Saram explains that some ordinators are actually sympathetic towards the dissident priests, but that's no excuse for me to kill any of the guards on the inside. She sends me on my way, and I go through the upper level door into the Hall of Processing. This zone contains a few ordinators patrolling the hallways. If seen, they would attack me on sight, and I was no match for them, especially without any of my magicka. I thought I had remembered Saram telling me that I should travel as far up and to the right as possible. Although she didn't actually say that for the prison keep, but I guess I got lucky in finding it pretty quickly. I had to use another scroll to unlock this door. As soon as I stepped foot in this zone, at least half a dozen ordinators aggroed onto me and began attacking. I panicked and ended up using my last unlocking scrolls on the wrong cell doors. However, I devised the perfect game plan for my needs in this moment. I really messed up by not having any magicka left in the tank, but I didn't need it for right now. Reverting to my last save, I snuck up to the top level of the halls of processing and unlocked the doors with a scroll. From here, I popped a levitate potion and flew over the head of every single ordinator. I then lowered myself enough, used another unlock scroll on Milo's cell, and was soon safe inside with her. She asked if I had brought the scrolls. She takes one for herself and says that we're going to use them to escape the prison. The plan is to meet her at the Dissident Priest Monastery in a place called Halamayan. She goes on to say that I should look for a woman named Lata Hatiria on the east docks of Ebonheart. She gives me specific instructions on what to do next, and that should lead me to Halamayan. She gives me even further directions on where to go from there. I ask about Halamayan, and she tells me it's an underground monastery / hideout for the dissident priests. It's on a remote island along Azura's coast. It can only be accessed at dawn or dusk, as those are the sacred twilight hours for Azura. Exiting the conversation, I equip my scroll of divine intervention and cast the spell. It conveniently teleports me to Ebonheart. Admittedly, I did get a little lost trying to leave, as it seemed like no matter where I went, I was going around in circles. Eventually, I decided to just use a levitate potion to fly over the walls and ledges of the fort. I laid eyes on the dock and went over in that direction. Just before them, there was a very interesting dragon statue, and it was surrounded by colorful and unique NPCs. I imagine that a lot of them have fascinating stories and side quests attached to them, and I would have loved to have stayed for a chat, but I decided to keep moving along. Making it to the left side of the docks, I approached a woman standing by a boat, and it turned out to be Blata. Remembering what Milo told me to do, Blata asked if I knew her, and I told her my name was Bard. She replied by saying her friend mentioned I wanted to go fishing. I said yes, and she replied saying that Mehra Milo showed her a great spot. That spot is Halamayan, and Blata is ready to take me there whenever. I paid her 54 gold, and she brought me over to Azura's coast region. Before I knew it, I was being dropped off at a dock and came face to face with the second person in this plan. I approached Vivrana Aryan and she introduced herself as a monk of Halamayan. She told me to take the stone pathway up the hill. At the top, a secret entrance leading inside of the monastery would be available, but only during dusk and dawn hours. Mehra Milo would be waiting within its library, accompanied by someone named Master Barelo. I followed her instructions and waited until 6 a.m. just outside of the entrance. It revealed a doorway into the monastery, and I had finally found myself within Halamayan. From here, I just went with my gut feeling and followed some pathways leading all over the stronghold. I soon stumbled upon the library, and there was Mehra Milo.
I don't know where to begin. It is such an honor to meet you.
Delighted, I began to speak with her. She thanked me for rescuing her and said that she's safe here at the monastery, where she'll stay in Master Barelo's company. I asked further questions about the dissident priests and their secret order, but received information I had already known. In fact, it was obvious from here that she wasn't going to be of any more use to this quest, and that Master Barelo was likely the person I would want to speak with. To be honest, I'm unsure if I missed it in my original interaction with her, or this was supposed to be her big turning point, but I didn't know that she was a dissident priest. I thought she had just read Progressive Truths, learned too much information, and was on the temple's radar. Regardless, I left the conversation and turned my attention to Gilvis Barelo. Barelo asked how he could help me, and I inquired about the lost prophecies. He said he reviewed the Apocrypha and found 2 unique passages about the Nerevarine prophecies. They're that of the Lost Prophecy and the 7 Curses. He thinks that these could be the so-called lost prophecies that Nabani Mesa needs. He hands me copies of these passages and goes on to say that he even prepared me a document called Kagranak's Tools. These writings shed light on the falsehoods of the tribunal and their corrupt nature. Barelo says that I need to lead the united peoples of the dissident priests and the temple against Dagoth-Ur. I ask about the lost prophecies, and Gilvis responds with, from 7th sign of 11th generation, neither hound nor gwar, nor seed nor harrow, but dragonborn and farstar marked, outlander incarnate beneath Red Mountain, blessed guest counters 7 curses, star blessed hand wields thrice cursed blade, to reap the harvest of the unborn house. He summarizes by saying an outlander will be a welcome guest. They confront 7 curses beneath Red Mountain, and their hand is blessed by Azura using a cursed blade. The blade will bring justice to either House Dagoth or House Dwemer, potentially both. Barelo theorizes that the Ashlanders have neglected and since lost this specific prophecy, as it calls for an outlander to fulfill the Nerevarine prophecies. I then asked about the 7 curses. Barelo responds, through the doors of the unborn house, where scoffers scoff and schemers scheme, from the halls of the oath-breaking house, rings 7 curses of gods blasphemed. First curse, curse of fire. Second curse, curse of ash. Third curse, curse of flesh. Fourth curse, curse of ghosts. Fifth curse, curse of seed. Sixth curse, curse of despair. Seventh curse, curse of dreams. His interpretation is that these 7 curses come from House Dagoth, House Dwemer, or perhaps both. Fire and ash from Red Mountain, flesh is corprus disease, ghosts, seed, and despair are unclear. Curse of dreams he believes relates to the sleepers and something called soul sickness. I asked further about Dagoth-Ur and the 6th house. Barelo is worried that the ghost fence is struggling to contain the evil within, as there have been more and more reports about horrific creatures and cases of blight in the region. The temple's powers are failing while Dagoth-Ur's are only growing stronger. Now more than ever do the people need a sign of hope, for the Nerevarine to lead them into battle. Exiting the conversation, I wanted to take a look at the notes Barelo had given me. The 7 curses and the lost prophecy more or less tell the same story. Kagranak's Tools, on the other hand, is very fascinating. It goes as follows. Beneath Red Mountain, Dwemer miners discovered a great magical stone. By diverse methods, Lord Kagranak, High Priest and Magecrafter of the ancient Dwemer, determined that this magical stone was the heart of the god Lorkhan, cast here in the Dawn Era as punishment for his mischief in creating the mortal world. Determined to use its divine powers to create a new god for the exclusive benefit of the Dwemer, Kagranak forged 3 great enchanted artifacts, which are called Kagranak's Tools. Wraithguard is an enchanted gauntlet to protect its wearer from destruction when tapping the heart's power. Sunder is an enchanted hammer to strike the heart and produce the exact volume and quality of power desired. Keening is an enchanted blade that is used to flay and focus the power that rises from the heart. When Kagranak used these tools on the heart in the Battle of Red Mountain, no one knows what happened, but the Dwemer race disappeared entirely from the mortal world. Lord Nerevar and Lord Dagoth retrieved these tools and didn't know what to do with them. Nerevar asked Dagoth to guard the tools while he went to consult with his counselors, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil. He left and spoke with his 3 counselors, and they decided to return together to Red Mountain to decide what to do. But while Nerevar was gone, Dagoth was tempted and confused by the powers of the tools. When Nerevar and the counselors arrived, he refused to give up the tools, claiming he had sworn to Nerevar to protect them. Then Dagoth fought with Nerevar and the counselors, and was mortally wounded and driven off, and the tools were recovered. Then Nerevar and his counselors decided to take the tools for safekeeping. They all swore a great oath, never to use the tools, but after Nerevar's death, Vivek, Almalexia, and Sothasil yielded to temptation. They took these tools themselves and went to Lorkhan's heart buried beneath Red Mountain and gave themselves divine powers. But Dagoth had not died. We don't know what happened, but this is what we believe. His experiments with Kagranak's tools had joined him to the heart's divine nature in some way, so that he learned to draw power directly from the heart. We conjecture that Dagoth, driven by anger and greed, used the heart without caution and restraint, and, as a result, he has become terribly powerful and terribly mad. But the tribunal showed great care and restraint in their use of the tools, and so they were not driven mad, and they did many good things. Nonetheless, the tribunal too appeared to have been corrupted by the heart's power, though more subtly. Kagranak's tools are cursed. Stealing power from the heart of a god is a terrible folly and fated to disaster. The tribunal is losing its battle to control the power of the heart. They're sustained by the same tainted power that drives Dagoth mad. They grow weak and cannot protect us from Dagoth. But even if they could, would we be wise to worship gods such as these? They conceal the truth from us out of shame. They persecute the Nerevarine and the dissident priests out of shame, when they should be welcoming them and enlisting their aid against Dagoth. The tribunal have done much good for Morrowind and the Dunmer, but they succumb to the temptation of Kagranak's tools, and though these tools once may have seemed the instruments of salvation, now they must be seen as instruments of doom. With that, it's time to leave Halamayan and return back to the Ashirliku camp in order to give these over to Nabani Mesa, thus ending the quest, Mehra Milo and the Lost Prophecies.